In the previous video, we talked about Anne's life in hiding. In this video, we are going to talk about her life and death in the concentration camp. Men and women prisoners were separated on the Auschwitz platform. They had to line up in rows of 5. Girls and boys younger than 15 had to stand with their mothers. A Nazi doctor checked all the prisoners and sent them either left or right. Edith, Margot, Anne, and Auguste Van Pels were sent to the same side. They walked with other female prisoners to another building where they had to wait for hours. There, they had to hand in everything they had brought with them and take off their clothes. They were also registered, and an identification number was tattooed on their arms. The women were shaved bald and then put under a shower. Finally, they could drink some water. After the shower, they were given random clothes and shoes because there were no more striped prison clothes available. One would get a summer's dress, the other a thick woolen dress, 2 left shoes, warm shoes. The guards did not care. Then they were sent to another barrack, a large shed with wooden bunk beds. There, the women finally learned the awful truth. All Jewish men, women, and children from their train that had been sent to the other side had died in the camp gas chambers. The gas chambers were large rooms with closable openings in the ceiling. The Nazis had set these up to look like bathrooms. The guards would throw down pellets of poisonous gas among the prisoners through the openings in the ceiling. As soon as these pellets came into contact with air, they would change into lethal gas. Very quickly, everyone in that room would be dead. The bodies were then incinerated in large ovens, the crematoria. The new prisoners were kept in a separate part of Auschwitz-Birkenau in order to learn the rules of the camp. The camp managers used other prisoners to supervise them. These couples were strict and would beat their fellow prisoners with clubs. Every day, the new prisoners had to cut sods of turf and carry heavy rocks. They also had to stand to attention for hours. Everyone had to stand in line to be counted. The food in the camp was bad. Watery soup, a small piece of bread, sometimes with a little margarine or sausage, and weak coffee. Because of these awful conditions, Anne and Margot contracted scabies, an illness brought by mites, little creatures that cause itchy bumps. There was a special scabies barracks, and Margot and Anne had to go there. Edith helped them as much as she could. However, because of the risk of contagion, she was not allowed inside, so she dug a hole under the barracks wall. In this way, she managed to slip her daughters the occasional piece of bread. There were regular selections. In one selection, the Nazi doctors would send the women who were sick to the gas chamber. In another, they would look to see which women were still suitable to work in Nazi Germany. These prisoners were sent to another camp. There was one such selection at the end of October 1944. Edith Frank was designated to join the group that would stay in Auschwitz-Birkenau. Anne, Margot, and Auguste Van Pels were to go away with the transport. After a grueling journey of a few days, they arrived at Bergen-Belsen, a concentration camp in the north of Nazi Germany. There was not enough room here for so many extra prisoners, so they were initially housed in large tents. But a few days later, there was a heavy storm and the tents were blown down. Now they were forced to move into the barracks, which were already overcrowded. Each barrack had hundreds of women propped up against each other. Bergen-Belsen consisted of different sections, which were separated by barbed wire fences. Armed soldiers in watchtowers kept an eye on everyone. The prisoners were not allowed to go near the barbed wire fences, but they did in secret anyway when it was dark. They hoped to find out if any friends or family members had arrived at the camp. In the section known as the Sternlager, there were Jews who the Nazis wanted to exchange with the Allied forces for German prisoners of war. One of these prisoners was Anne's friend Hannah Goslar. Hannah heard that Anne was also in Bergen-Belsen. She didn't understand. Hadn't Anne fled to Switzerland? One evening, Hannah managed to speak to Anne. Crying, they stood on either side of the barbed wire fence, unable to see each other. Anne said that her parents were dead and that she had almost nothing to eat. Hannah found some food and clothes for her, which she brought the next time. She threw the package over the barbed fence and then heard Anne screaming. Someone else had caught the package and had run away with it. A few days later, she threw another package over the fence. Luckily, Anne got that one. They were able to talk a few times until Anne and Margot had to move to another place within the camp. Nanny Blitz, a classmate from the Jewish Lyceum, also saw Anne in Bergen-Belsen. Anne was very thin, was covered in lice, and had wrapped a blanket around herself. Anne told her about their time hiding in the secret annex, the betrayal, and that she had to come to Bergen-Belsen via Auschwitz. Anne and Nanny talked regularly until Anne came down with typhus, as did Margot. This is an extremely contagious disease that is spread by lice. Thousands of prisoners in the camp suffered from it. They had high fever, skin rashes, headaches, and needed to vomit. Rachel van Amerhogen was another prisoner in Bergen-Belsen who could remember Margot and Anne. After the war, she said that Anne and Margot looked absolutely ravaged by typhus. They were constantly cold because they lay in their barrack beside the door that never stopped opening and closing. Margot was the first to succumb, and Anne died a few days later. It was February 1945. In February, Auguste van Pels was transported from Bergen-Belsen to Rangoon. She was one of around 500 prisoners who were selected to work in a factory for aircraft parts. In April 1945, the American troops came so close to the camp that the camp leader decided to evacuate. All prisoners were put on the train to Theresienstadt concentration camp without food or water. Many of them died during this journey, including Auguste van Pels. What was the fate of the men from the secret annex, you might ask? After arriving at Auschwitz, Otto Frank, Hermine, and Peter van Pels and Fritz Pfeffer were put to work in a gravel quarry outside of the camp. They had to fill cars with shingle. Hermine van Pels hurt his hand during this heavy work. The next day, he remained behind in the barracks. When the Nazi doctor came by to check on him, he was taken away. Otto and Peter van Pels saw him being marched away in a group of selected men. Hermine van Pels was killed in one of the gas chambers in early October 1944. Fritz Pfeffer was sent off on a transport in another selection and ended up in the Neuengamme concentration camp near Hamburg in November. The work was backbreaking and prisoners were given very little to eat. Fritz Pfeffer died of exhaustion and sickness on December 20th, 1944. Peter van Pels ended up working in the post-collection point in Auschwitz. Some prisoners were allowed to receive post and packages. Some packages contained food, and Peter was sometimes able to steal some of these. He shared the extra food with Otto Frank. When the Russian army was approaching Auschwitz-Birkenau in January 1945, the guards cleared the camp. They destroyed as many documents as they could and blew up the gas chambers and the crematoria. prisoners who could still work were made to leave with the guards. Peter Van Pels was one of them. Otto Frank was weak. He had been sick in the infirmary for weeks. He tried to persuade Peter to hide somewhere, but Peter decided he would go. He was convinced he would survive. Otto was afraid that the sick who would remain behind would be shot. But the rapid advance of the Russian troops put the Nazis on the run. After a long and difficult journey, Peter Van Pels arrived at Mauthausen concentration camp. He was sent on to another camp in the area, Melk. There, the prisoners worked on the construction of an underground factory for tank and aircraft parts. They had to drill out hallways, remove soil, make beams to support tunnels, and load and unload building materials. It was dangerous work, and there were frequent accidents. The prisoners were in rags and sometimes no longer had shoes. They were given hardly any food. In the end, there wasn't even bread. In early April, the Russian army advanced so close that the guards evacuated Melk camp. Peter returned, sick, to Mauthausen, where he ended up in the infirmary. It was full beyond capacity, and there were no medicines. Prisoners sometimes had to lie four to a bed. Mauthausen camp was liberated on May 5th, but for Peter, this liberation came too late. He was so sick and weak that he died a few days later on May 10th, 1945. But for Otto Frank, the liberation came just in time. Russian soldiers entered Auschwitz concentration camp on January 27, 1945, where they encountered as many as 7,000 prisoners still alive, including Otto Frank. After he was liberated, he wrote that it was truly a miracle that he was still alive.